are these people?
Last week, hold on, let me see. Yeah, okay. All right. So last week, you reported on how essentially the humanitarian aid, quote unquote, in Gaza is being privatized in so many words. So to add to the fuck shit, this is once again due to the reporting of Robert Inkalesh over at MintPress News. He's reporting that Israel-backed militias who are linked to ISIS are looting Gaza aid under the watch of the IOF. So that's why he titled this article. So we'll get into it in terms of what is going on. So Robert reports, Israeli officials often claim that Hamas has been looting aid heading to Gaza, yet the evidence suggests the opposite. New reports and eyewitness accounts indicate that Israel is backing ISIS-linked militians who are working to replace Hamas security forces and are looting humanitarian aid under the watchful eye of IDF drones. New evidence recently emerged of ISIS-linked militias in Gaza operating inside the Israeli-controlled buffer zone and controlling roads on which aid was destined to be transported. These armed men were photographed brandishing automatic weapons, wearing Israeli military tactical vests, and bearing Palestinian flag patches on their helmets.
ISIS agents use Krav Maga. We've got an ex-Mossad guy. He comes in on Thursday.
To the naked eye, they could be mistaken for Palestinian security force officers. In fact, they are members of an infamous criminal network responsible for looting humanitarian aid. On May 21st, 15 World Food Program trucks carrying flour were looted, and UN sources suggest the perpetrators to these armed factions. Yet they claim to be a legitimate opposition group poised to replace Hamas. For some 80 days, Israel had imposed a total blockade of all food, medical supplies, water, and fuel entering the territory. As soon as a small number of trucks were allowed to enter, the militants were spotted, sporting new military gear and forced to intercept their humanitarian supplies. You added this.
Yeah.
So was this wasn't from MintPress, right?
ScheerPost. ScheerPost.
Okay.
Is Jonathan K. Cook, who writes that Israel's claim that Hamas is stealing aid is so preposterous, no serious journalist or politician ought to give it any kind of airing. Yet, there is a continuous cropping up in the coverage of Gaza. How do I know Israel's claim is utterly worthless? For this simple reason. Israel has a fleet of surveillance drones constantly hovering over the tiny strip of land that is Gaza, monitoring every inch of the territory. The incessant whine you hear every time you watch someone there being interviewed as one of those drones. There are Israel's eyes on the enclave. If you are outside in Gaza, you might as well be living in the Truman Show. Where Hamas stealing aid in Gaza, Israel would easily be able to document it. It would have the video footage from its drones. The fact that it has not provided any footage showing Hamas theft of aid, its ransacking of aid trucks, or its fighters smuggling themselves into aid warehouses is confirmation enough that Israel has simply invented this claim to rationalize its plans to starve the people of Gaza to death through months of an aid blockade or force them to flee into neighboring Sinai, whichever comes first. Without its disinformation campaign about Hamas stealing aid, Israel knows popular revulsion and its starving campaign would grow quickly, and Western governments would further struggle to keep opposition in check. There are lots of other reasons, of course, to reject Israel's lies about Hamas stealing aid, not least because every single charity and aid agency dealing with Gaza says that aid is not being stolen by Hamas, but also because, were Hamas fighters doing so, they would be stealing from their own families, from their children and grandparents, who are much more vulnerable to Israel's starvation campaign than they are. The idea that Hamas is stealing aid makes sense only to a racist European colonial mindset in which Hamas fighters are viewed as boogeymen, figures indifferent to the deaths of their own children, wives, and parents. What undoubtedly is
Actually, that's
happening.
a very interesting
Point.
right, but it's interesting that Jonathan make this point is that which to kind of give a parallel or to Bukele
Yeah.
that you reported on in the last segment, you know, like because it's the, like a lot of Israelis make the association, whether subtly or not, that Hamas equals Palestinians. Well, if you're going to say that, then essentially you're making the case that Hamas is essentially stealing from its own people, which I think kind of works, as he's saying, it kind of works with that kind of mindset. I think it's easier for people to believe in that given our own racist attitudes in the West. So I will also kind of argue, I'm not sure of the word, but it's, but it's the idea that Hamas would essentially steal from their own people. So, that humanizing, so basically making them seem like animals, when in retrospect, Israelis essentially have done that to their own people willingly in the guise of protecting them from so-called hostages. I don't want to say so-called because we know that hostage is still there, but Israelis don't give a shit about their own hostages. They're willing to kill them in order to keep essentially the propaganda going. So
Yeah.
it's almost kind of like calling the kettle black in this regard. That, like the argument that Israelis make is that, oh, Hamas is terrible. They're stealing from, Palestinians. So that's why they need to be destroyed. Well, you're not making that case for the IDF by order of the Israeli government, who essentially are willing to kill their own, and that has been reported on, but those stories kind of get brushed aside.
Yeah.
In the guise of, oh, well, like, yeah, they don't want to admit that openly, or at least kind of keep that,
Yeah.
under the hood, so to speak.
Well,
So,
and here's the
but yeah,
kicker.
just it's interesting that you made that connection that it can be used. It works here due
Right.
to the our, I guess, essentially our racist,
Yep.
like undertones that we
Yeah.
experience here.
It's the classic Carlin, Israeli like soldiers are, freedom fighters, whereas the brown ones like are terrorists, right? So what undoubtedly is happening is that Israel is allowing the strongest extended families in Gaza, often crime families with significant private arsenals, to loot the aid. That has become a serious problem since Israel killed off Gaza's civilian police force in violation of international law, leaving no one to enforce public order. When everyone's starving, the most powerful families mobilize their strength to grab an unfair share of the aid. That was an entirely predictable outcome of Israel's policy to smash all of Gaza's institutions, including its hospitals, government offices, and police stations, on the bogus pretext that they were Hamas. Same thing with like the money lenders as well. Because we talked about that before, where like physical money is deteriorating in Gaza, and there's entire scams of like how money gets in. Israel's fine with that crime. They're okay with that. So, but anyway, note too that Israel has long cultivated close ties to Palestinian crime families because they provide a potential alternative and more co-optable power base to the Palestinian national movements and are a good source of collaborators. So, just in case you were wondering. Yep. So, and ISIS. But anyway, you brought this?
Yeah. So this is from Mohammed at itsmo9. This was a long thread. I didn't want to put it all here, but I think you get enough information from this just from these two tweets. He tweeted, the IOF allows sunflower trucks and assigns Yashur Abu Shabab to secure them up to the crossing area. Yashir Abu Shabab, who stole thousands of trucks before the truce and is now directly cooperating with the IOF. Yasser and the IOF are two sides of the same coin. So, so essentially, Shabab is Palestinian.
Yep.
Siding with Israel to screw over his own people. So,
Yep.
Wait, did I skip?
I
No,
don't think so.
I thought it was 2, but anyway, that's fine.
Yep.
You get the point. The leader of the Israeli-aligned militia is a man named Yasser Abu Shabab, a member of the Taraban tribe that extends between the Negev, Gaza, and Sinai. However, he and others affiliated with the Taraban have long been denounced as not representing the tribe to their extensive criminal past. Abdul Shabab was well known in Gaza for his fierce opposition to Hamas and had been arrested for smuggling narcotics. He also maintained a direct connection to ISIS in the Egyptian Sinai. When Israeli bombing destroyed the jails run by Hamas security forces during the early days of the Gaza war, the infamous criminal managed to escape. From there, Abdul Shabab quickly began building a militant force numbering of at least 100 men, many of whom were also previously imprisoned and had known ties to ISIS and al-Qaeda-linked groups. An internal UN memo reported by the Financial Times in November 2024 said that Abdul Shabab's men were operating inside Israel's buffer zone, looting aid shipments with the passive, if not active, benevolence of Israeli forces. This is notable as Israeli forces have routinely shot and killed civilians attempting to enter that same zone, even when coordinated in advance. While these criminal factions began looting early into the Gaza war, they became more prominent following Israel's invasion of Rafah on May 6th of last year. Up until that point, Hamas-led Palestinian police had helped coordinate aid deliveries through the Rafah crossing. The security was provided despite Israel threatening to bomb the police officers if they approached aid trucks, often forcing Gaza's law enforcement into a hands-off role. But once Rafah was invaded and police disappeared, Israeli forces worked in proximity with criminal networks to intercept and sell stolen aid into intermediaries.
Yeah, it's you.
Do you have the music playing?
No.
Oh, it's me.
Yep.
Oh, okay. The result was a massive price hike for basic goods, with these gangs reportedly drip feeding supplies to local sellers, maintaining artificial scarcity during a famine. Israel's leading human rights organization, B'Tselem, has labeled the policy manufactured famine. Two sources working with aid agencies in Gaza confirmed to MintPress News that all aid entering the strip is either subject to a bribe paid to these gangs or is partially or completely confiscated. Both spoke on condition of anonymity, stating that the gangs are widely believed to be coordinating with Israeli forces. Prior to January 19th, when a temporary ceasefire began, these gangs wore face coverings and operated as a ragtag militia. In recent weeks, however, they have rebranded themselves as the Anti-Terror Service, claiming to be a grassroots opposition to Hamas. On Abdul Shabab's Facebook page, he now describes himself as a grassroots leader who stood up against corruption and looting, posting photos of himself patrolling roads and claiming to work with international aid organizations to ensure the delivery of flour trucks. Back in November 2024, he told the Washington Post that Hamas has left us with nothing, even denying that his men carried weapons. He claimed that the looting was done by unarmed individuals and they avoided stealing food intended for children. Yet aid workers and truck drivers insist his men are committing armed robbery. So I guess you also I think you added this. I guess. Yeah, I did. So at Mohammed Shahad 2 tweeted, Israel is aiding ISIS-linked terrorists and criminals to sow chaos and famine in Gaza. Shadi al-Sofi, a wanted murderer and son of an informant, collaborated with Israel, and Abdul Shabab, a drug dealer, are the main warlords responsible for looting most aid under IDF protection. They formed gangs of over 200 armed criminals and established a military-like compound, per the UN, in an empty death zone. Scroll down, please.
Yep.
Fully under IDF control, where they looted only this Saturday night about 100 aid trucks at once. This way, Israel can absolve itself of its responsibility for its deliberate starvation policy in Gaza and say, look, we're letting aid in. It's Hamas's fault that food doesn't reach people, as claimed by Senator John Fetterman yesterday. IDF soldiers never fire those gang members as they loot aid right in front of Israeli tanks and troops in a closed military zone that no Gazian is allowed into. The IDF only fires at local policemen whenever they try to prevent the looting. Yasser Abdul Shabab was arrested by Gaza's local police multiple times in the past for drug smuggling and trading, which is often facilitated by ISIS groups in Sinai. Hamas militants attempted to eliminate him yesterday in an attack that killed 11 of his gang, including his brother and partner Fatih and the gang's accountant. 30 others were wounded. Shadi al-Sofi murdered in 2020 Jabir al-Irik, I guess. Sorry, pronunciation. I guess. A quick maybe. A PLFP member whom Israel had sentenced to life and imprisoned for 15 years for killing al-Sofi's father during the first Intifada for spying on Palestinians for Israel. Al-Sofi was convicted in a Gazian court, and the local police captured him in a special operation in late 2020 before he broke out of prison with the help of ISIS-linked militants and was smuggled out of Gaza to Sinai, then reported to Israel's Negev. He returned to Gaza with the IDF ground invasion, where he now co-leads the criminal gangs that loot aid and sabotage humanitarian work under IDF protection. So back to the article. Another warlord reportedly backed by Israel is Shadi al-Sufi, a convicted murderer and drug trafficker who had been sentenced to death. In 2020, he assassinated Ajir al-Kik, I guess?
Yep.
A senior commander in the PFLP's Adu Ali Mustafa brigades. He reportedly later worked with ISIS contacts to accept to Sinai. A senior official with major humanitarian organization told MintPress News, in the areas where the security forces are operating, the situation is always more stable, and they have repeatedly cracked down on black market operations. Anyone telling you the gangs are helpful in the past, helping the people is a liar. That is all I can say. In November, Haaretz reported the IDF is aware of the problem. They say at one point the government has even considered making the clans to which the armed men belong responsible for distributing aid to Gaza residents, even though some of the clan's members are involved in terrorism and some are affiliated with extremist organizations like the Islamic State. This now appears to be the Israeli strategy to deputize these criminal gangs as a replacement security force to supplant Hamas rule. The makeover also coincides with efforts by the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, a US-linked initiative rumored to involve private military contractors, raising concerns that such groups may be tapped to cooperate with these armed networks. A source affiliated with the Palestinian security forces in Gaza told MintPress News that a similar strategy was attempted in northern Gaza, but that Hamas, working with politically unaffiliated locals, dismantled the criminal networks that began forming under Israeli supervision. Meanwhile, the UN and every major humanitarian organization that has addressed the issue have pointed the finger at the gangs, not Hamas, for looting. None have reported credible instances of Hamas stealing aid. In fact, the Biden administration even asked Israel in February 2024 to halt its targeting of Hamas-led security forces, which had been helping coordinate delivery of humanitarian trucks into Gaza. Hamas is ISIS, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu declared, but recent actions by Israel suggest the opposite, that is, actively empowering Zionist factions to undermine Hamas in Gaza. In March, the Israeli military floated the idea of arming certain tribal clans to establish so-called Hamas free zones. Among those considered was the Dugmush clan, known for its links to ISIS. Since Hamas was voted into power and took control of Gaza in 2007, it has fought a years-long war against Safahi jihadist factions inside the Strip. In 2009, it crushed an al-Qaeda-aligned uprising that left 22 dead. Sporadic bombings and assassinations attempts followed. Tensions between Hamas and al-Qaeda affiliates continued intermittently for years, marked by sporadic violence and periodic mass arrests, most notably in 2015, when Hamas detained over 50 Safahist militants after a wave of bombings targeting civilians in Gaza.
How about this?
So
it mentioned the Salafist movement a bit ago, right? So I just wanted to kind of clarify what that was, right? The Salafi movement, or Salafism, is a fundamentalist revival movement within Sunni Islam, originating in the late 19th century and influential in the Islamic world to this day. I mean, see also Wahhabism and all those fundamental Islamic stuff, you know? Like, we hear that thrown around in the region a lot, the Salafist sort of thing. So, useful to know what that is. That is, of course, Wikipedia's definition, by the way. So, take that with, you know, grains of salt and whatnot. But
that same year, ISIS formally entered the fray. The Sheikh Omar Hadid Brigade, an ISIS affiliate, announced its presence in Gaza shortly after ISIS executed Hamas commander Sheikh Abdul Salah Taha in Syria's Yarmouk camp. Hamas responded swiftly. Its security forces hunted down and killed the group's leader, Yonis Hunar, in a gunfight. In 2018, ISIS would officially declare war on Hamas, urging its followers to carry out attacks in order to overthrow the group in Gaza. Now, in a bitter twist, Israel is backing many of these elements. Under the guise of aid security, it is arming and enabling former ISIS and al-Qaeda linked operatives, along with known traffickers and warlords, to carve out zones of control in Gaza. These forces are marketed as a grassroots alternative to Hamas. In practice, they're eluding aid and destabilizing local governments under the unwatchful eye of Israeli drones. So, a mess, and honestly kind of complicated, but essentially, Israel is recruiting ISIS to do their dirty work.
Yeah.
In addition to themselves.
Terrorism, terror, terror organization, terrorist attacks, terror, terrorism, terrorist network, terrorist attacks, terrorist group, terrorists, terrorists, instruments of terror, network,
instruments,
terror cells, terrorists, terrorizing terror and murder. Thank you all.
Oh, okay. Thanks. I got it, I think. Terror. Got it.
Right.
Yep. Cool. Well, yeah, Israel's been, I mean, ISIS equals Israel Secret Intelligence Service, as we all know. So,
right.
But, yep. How it goes. How the cookie crumbles, as they say.
And yeah, and that's why we're demonetized. So, but again, shout out to Robert. I mean, look, Robert, we love you here. It's obvious by now. Like, we would love to talk to you and hear more about you. Yes, we definitely want to talk to you. Like, we actually mentioned this last night. We can probably do a playlist of Robert alone, just given the number of stories that we have covered by him, you know, because one thing we definitely appreciate about him, he's extremely thorough. So, Robert, you're welcome to come on if you ever want to chat to us, and, you know, if you want to give us the ends of your investigative reporting through MintPress. But regardless, for the rest of y'all, if you'd like to donate to help us feature journalists like Robert on a regular basis, you can scan the QR code that you see on your screen or type in the Ko-fi link that you see at the bottom of your screen. Or if you're in the YouTube chat, you can type in !donate, all one word, and the Ko-fi link will pop up. And if you want to donate, you can donate right there. You can also donate via Cash App, PayPal, and Substack, especially if you want to give monthly. And then if you give on Substack, you can see Indy will send you everything in independent media pretty much every day, including our stuff. So it might be worth doing that, especially if you're interested in supporting us monthly. But as we keep saying, we know times are tough. So the free way to support us is liking and subscribing to our content. And please share our content to help fight the suppression that we see on YouTube, and make sure you leave a comment. Does this surprise you that Israel is essentially hiring ISIS to essentially do their dirty work in Gaza by essentially recruiting criminals to loot aid that is meant to go to Palestinians? So let us know in the chat what you think, and thank you for watching.